Chapter 1. The Exploding Birthday Cake. The cake, you chattering chittamong. Where is the cake? Steer 'em, free 'em, hash 'em, where is the cake? Cried Ijabo, chief footman in the palace of Pumperdink, bouncing into the royal pantry. The three cooks, too astonished for speech, and with staring eyes, pointed to the center table. The great, gorgeous birthday cake was gone, though not 2 seconds before it had been placed on the table by Hashem himself. "It was my masterpiece," sobbed Hashem, tearing off his cap and throwing his apron over his head. "Help, robbers, thieves!" cried Styrum and Freem, running to the window. Here was a howdido. The trumpets blowing for the celebration to begin, and the best part of the celebration gone. "We'll all be dipped for this," wailed Ijabo, flinging open the second-best china closet so violently that 3 silver cups and a pewter mug tumbled out. Just then there was a scream from Hashem, who had removed the apron from his head. "Look!" he shrieked. "There it is!" Back to the table rushed the other 3, Steerum and Freem rubbing their eyes, and Ijabo his head where the cups had bumped him severely. Upon the table stood the royal cake, as pink and perfect as ever. "It was there all the time, mince my eyebrows," spluttered Hashem in an injured voice. "Called me a chittimong, did you?" Grasping a big wooden spoon, he ran angrily at Ijabo. "Was it gone, or wasn't it?" cried Ijabo, appealing to the others and hastily catching up a bread knife to defend himself. Instantly there arose a babble. "It was. It wasn't. Was. Rap, bang, clatter." In a minute they were in a furious argument, not only with words but with spoons, forks, and bowls. And dear knows what would have become of the cake had not a bell rung loudly and the second footman poked his head through the door. "The cake! Where is the cake?" he wheezed importantly. So Ijabo, dodging 3 cups and a salt cellar, seized the great silver platter and dashed into the great banquet hall. 1 pink coat-tail was missing, and his wig was somewhat elevated over the left ear from the lump raised by the pewter mug, but he summoned what dignity he could and joined the grand procession of footmen who were bearing gold and silver dishes filled with goodies for the birthday feast of Prince Pompadore of Pumperdink. The royal guests were already assembled, and just as Ijabo entered, the pages blew a shrill blast upon their silver trumpets, and the prime pumpers stepped forward to announce their majesties. "Oh yes! Oh yes!" shouted the prime pumper, pounding on the floor with his silver staff, while the guests politely inclined their heads just as if they had not heard the same announcement dozens of times before. "Oh yes! Oh yes! Pompous the proud and posy pink, king and queen of Pumperdink, way for the king and clear the floor, way for our good Prince Pompadore. Way for the elegant elephant, way for the king and the queen and the prince, I say." So everybody weighed, which is to say they bowed, and down the center of the room swept Pompous, very fat and gorgeous in his purple robes and jeweled crown, and Posy Pink, very stately and queen-like in her ermine cloak, and Prince Pompadore, very straight and handsome. In fact, they looked exactly as a good old-fashioned royal family should. But Kabumpo, who swayed along grandly after the prince, few royal families could boast of so royal and elegant an elephant. He was huge and gray. On his head he wore jeweled bands, and a jeweled court robe billowed out majestically as he walked. His little eyes twinkled merrily, and his big ears flapped so sociably that just to look at him put one in a good humor. Kabumpo was the only elephant in Pumperdink, or in any kingdom near Pumperdink, so no wonder he was a prime favorite at court. He had been given to the king at Pompa's christening by a friendly stranger, and since then had enjoyed every luxury and advantage. He was not only treated as a member of the royal family, but was always addressed as Sir by all of the palace servants. "He lends an air of elegance to our court," the king was fond of saying, and the elegant elephant he surely had become. Now, an elegant elephant at court might seem strange in a regular up-to-date country, but Pumperdink is not at all regular nor up-to-date. It is a cozy, old-fashioned kingdom, way up in the northern part of the Gillikin country of Oz, old-fashioned enough to wear knee breeches and have a king, and cozy enough to still enjoy birthday parties and candy pulls. If Pompous the king was a bit proud, who could blame him? His queen was the loveliest, his son the most charming, and his elephant the most elegant and unusual for 20 kingdoms round about. And Pompous, for all his pride, had a very simple way of ruling. When the Pumperdinkians did right, they were rewarded. When they did wrong, they were dipped. In the very center of the courtyard there is a great stone well with a huge stone bucket. Into this Pumperdink well all offenders and lawbreakers were lowered. Its waters were dark blue, and as the color stuck to one for several days, the inhabitants of Pumperdink were careful to behave well, so that the chief dipper, who turned the wheel that raised and lowered the bucket, often had days at a time with nothing to do. This time he spent in writing poetry, and as Prince Pompadore took the place of honor at the head of the table, the chief dipper rose from his humble place at the foot, and with a moist flourish burst forth, "O Pompadore of Pumperdink, of all perfection you're the pink, your praises now I utter. Your eyes are clear as applesauce, your head the best I've come across, your heart is soft as butter." "Very good," said the king, and the chief dipper sat down, blushing with pride and confusion. Prince Pompadore bowed, and the rest of the party clapped tremendously. "Sounds like a dipper full of nonsense to me," wheezed Kabumpo, who stood directly back of Prince Pompadore's throne, leisurely consuming a bale of hay placed on the floor beside him. "It may surprise you to know that all the animals in Oz can talk, but such is the case, and Pumperdink being in the fairy country of Oz, Kabumpo could talk as well as any man, and better than most. Eyes like applesauce, heart of butter. Ho ho karumph!" The elegant elephant laughed so hard he shook all over. Then, slyly reaching over the Prime Pumper's shoulder, he snatched his glass of pink lemonade and emptied it down his great throat, setting the tumbler back before the old fellow turned his head. "Did you call, sir?" asked Djabo, hurrying over. He had mistaken Kabumpo's laugh for a command. "Yes, why did you not give His Excellency lemonade?" demanded the elegant elephant sternly. "I did. He must have drunk it, sir," stuttered Djabo. "Drunk it!" cried the Prime Pumper, pounding on the table indignantly. "I never had any." "Fetch him a glass at once," rumbled Kabumpo, waving his trunk, and Djabo, too wise to argue with a member of the royal family, brought another glass of lemonade. But no sooner had he done so than the mischievous elephant stole that, next the Prime Pumper's plate and roll, and all so quickly no one but Prince Pompadore knew what was happening, and poor Djabo was kept running backwards and forwards till his wig stood on end with confusion and rage. All of this was very amusing to the prince, and helped him to listen pleasantly to the 15 long birthday speeches addressed to him by members of the royal guard. But if the speeches were dull, the dinner was not. The fiddlers fiddled so merrily, and the chief cook Hashem had so outdone himself in the preparation of new and delicious dainties, that by ice cream and cake time everyone was in a high good humor. "The cake, my good Djabo! Fetch forth the cake," commanded King Pompous, beaming fondly upon his son. Nervously, Djabo stepped to the side table and lighted the 18 tall birthday candles. A cake that had disappeared once might easily do so again, and Djabo was anxious to have it cut and out of his way at least. Hashem, looking through a tiny crack in the door, almost burst with pride as his gorgeous pink masterpiece was set down before the prince. "Many happy returns of your 18th birthday," cried the courtiers, jumping to their feet and waving their napkins enthusiastically. "Thank you," chuckled Pompadore, bowing low. "I feel that this is but one of many more to come, which may sound strange, but Pumperdink being in Oz, one may have as many 18th birthdays as one cares to have." This was Pompa's 10th, and while the courtiers drank his health, the prince made ready to blow out the birthday candles. "That's right, blow 'em all out at once," cried the king. So Pumpa puffed out his cheeks and blew with all his might, but not a candle flickered. Then he tried again. Indeed, he puffed and blew until he was a regular royal purple, but nary a candle flame so much as wavered. "Stubbornest candles I ever saw," blustered King Pompous. Then he puffed out his cheeks and blew like a porpoise. So did Queen Posy and the Prime Pumper. So did everybody. They blew until every dish upon the table skipped, and they all sank back exhausted in their chairs, but the candles burned as merrily as ever. Then Kabumpo took a hand, or rather a trunk. He had been watching the proceedings with his twinkling little eyes. Now he took a tremendous breath, pointed his trunk straight at the cake, and blew with all his strength. Every candle went out, but stars! As they did, the great pink cake exploded with such force that half the courtiers were flung under the table and the rest knocked unconscious by flying fragments of icing, tumblers, and plates. "Treason!" screamed Pompous, the first to recover from the shock. "Who dared put gunpowder in the cake?" Brushing the icing from his nose, he glared around angrily. The first person to catch his eye was Hashem, the cook, who stood trembling in the doorway. "Dip him!" shouted the king furiously. And the chief dipper, only too glad of an excuse to escape, seized poor Hashem. "And him," ordered the king, as Ajabo tried to sidle out of the room. "And them!" As all the other footmen started to run, forming his victims in a line, the chief dipper marched them sternly from the banquet hall. Oh yes, everybody shall be dipped," mumbled the Prime Pumper, feebly raising his head. Oh no, nothing of the sort," snapped the king, fanning poor Queen Posy pink with a plate. She had fainted dead away. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" shouted Pompous, his anger rising again. "How should I know?" wheezed Kabumpo, dragging Prince Pompadore from beneath the table and pouring a jug of cream over his head. "Something hit me," moaned the prince, opening his eyes. "Of course it did," said Kabumpo. "The cake hit you. Made a great hit with us all, that cake." The elegant elephant looked ruefully at his silk robe of state, which was hopelessly smeared with icing, then put his trunk to his head, for something hard had struck him between the eyes. He felt about the floor and found the round, shiny object which he was about to show the king when Pompous pounced upon a tall scroll sitting upright in his tumbler. In the confusion of the moment it had escaped his attention. "Perhaps this will explain," spluttered the king, breaking the seal. Queen Posy, pink, opened her eyes with a sigh, and the courtiers, crawling out from beneath the table, looked up anxiously, for everyone was still dazed from the tremendous explosion. Pompous read the scroll to himself with popping eyes, and then began to dance up and down in a frenzy. "What is it? What is it?" cried the queen, trying to read over his shoulder. Then she gave a well-bred scream and fainted away in the arms of General Quakes, who had come up behind her. By this time the Prime Pumper had recovered sufficiently to remember that reading scrolls and court papers was his business. Somewhat unsteadily he walked over and took the scroll from the king. Oh yes, he faltered, pounding on the table. "Oh, never mind that," rumbled Kabumpo, flagging his ears. "Let's hear what it says." "Know ye began the old man in a high, shaky voice. "Know ye that unless ye, prince of ye ancient and honorable kingdom of Pumperdink, wed ye proper fairy princess in ye proper span of time, ye kingdom of Pumperdink shall disappear forever, and even longer from ye Gillikin country of Oz." J.G. "What?" screamed Pompadore, bounding to his feet. "Me? But I don't want to marry." "You'll have to," groaned the king with a wave at the scroll. The courtiers sat staring at one another in dazed disbelief. From the courtyard came the splash and splutter of the luckless footman and the dismal creaking of the stone bucket. "Oh!" wailed Pompa, throwing up his hands. "This is the worst 18th birthday I've ever had. I'll never have another as long as I live." Chapter 2. Picking a proper princess. What shall we do first? Groaned the king, holding his head with both hands. "Let me think." "Right," said Kabumpo. "Think by all means." So the great hall was cleared, and the king, with the mysterious scroll spread out before him, thought and thought and thought. But he did not make much headway, for, as he explained over and over to Queen Posy, who, with Pompadore, the Elegant Elephant, and the Prime Pumper, had remained to help him, how is one to know where to find the proper princess, and how is one to know the proper time for Pompa to wed her? Who was J.G.? How did the scroll get in the cake? The more the king thought about these questions, the more wrinkled his forehead became. "Why, we're liable to wake up any morning and find ourselves gone," he announced gloomily. "How does it feel to disappear, I wonder? I suppose it would give one rather a gone feeling, but I don't believe it would hurt." "Much," volunteered Kabumpo, glancing uneasily over his shoulder. "Perhaps not, but it would not get us anywhere. My idea is to marry the prince at once to a proper princess," put in the Prime Pumper, "and avoid all this disappearing." "You're in a great hurry to marry me off, aren't you?" said Pompadore sulkily. "For my part, I don't want to marry at all." "Well, that's very selfish of you, Pompa," said the king in a grieved voice. "Do you want your poor old father to disappear?" "Not only your poor old father," choked the Prime Pumper, rolling up his eyes. "How about me?" "Oh, you can disappear any time you want," said the prince unfeelingly. "It all started with that wretched cake," sighed the queen. "I am positive the scroll flew out of the cake when it exploded." "Of course it did," cried Pompous. "Let us send for the cook and question him." So Hashem, very wet and blue from his dip, was brought before the king. "A fine cook you are," roared Pompous, mixing gunpowder and scrolls in a birthday cake. "But I didn't," wailed Hashem, falling on his knees. "Only eggs, your highness, very best eggs, sugar, flour, spice, and—" "Bombshells!" cried the king angrily. "The cake disappeared before the party, your majesty," cried Ijabo. Everyone jumped at the sudden interruption, and Ijabo, who had crept in unnoticed, stepped before the throne. "Disappeared," continued Ijabo hoarsely, dripping blue water all over the royal rugs. "1 minute there it was on the pantry table." "Next minute, gone!" croaked Ijabo, flinging up his hands and shrugging his shoulders. Then, before a fellow could turn around, it was back. "'Tweren't our fault if magic got mixed into it, and here we have been dipped for nothing." "Well, why didn't you say so before?" asked the king in exasperation. "Fine chance I had to say anything," sniffed Ijabo, wringing out his lace ruffles. "Roar, you may have the day off, my good man," said Pompous with an apologetic cough. "And you also, with a wave at Hashem." Very stiffly the two walked to the door. "It's an off day for us, all right," said Ijabo ungraciously, and without so much as a bow the two disappeared. "I fear you were a bit hasty, my love," murmured Queen Posy, looking after them with a troubled little frown. "Well, who wouldn't be?" cried Pompous, ruffling up his hair. Here we are liable to disappear any minute, and all you do is to stand around and criticize me. Begone, he puffed angrily as a page stuck his head in the door. No use shouting at people to begone, said the elegant elephant testily. We'll all begone soon enough. At this, Queen Posy began to weep into her silk handkerchief, which sight so affected Prince Pompadore that he rushed forward and embraced her tenderly. "I'll marry," cried the prince impulsively. "I'll do anything. The trouble is, there aren't any fairy princesses around here." "There must be," said the king. "There is, there are," screamed the Prime Pumper, bouncing up suddenly. "Oh yes, oh yes!" "Has your majesty forgotten Faliro, royal princess of Follensby Forest?" "Why, of course!" The king snapped his fingers joyfully. "Everyone says Faliro is a fairy princess." "She must be the proper one. Faliro," trumpeted the elegant elephant, sitting down with a terrific thud. "That awful old creature. You ought to be ashamed of yourself." "Silence!" thundered the king. "Nonsense!" trumpeted Kabumpo. "She's 1,000 years old and as ugly as a stone lukugu. Don't you marry her, Pompa." "I command him to marry her," cried the king, opening his eyes very wide and bending forward. "Faliero?" gasped the prince, scarcely believing his ears. No wonder Pompadore was shocked. Faliro, although a princess in her own right and of royal fairy descent, was so unattractive that in all her 1,000 years of life no one had wished to marry her. She lived in a small hut in the great forest kingdom next to Pumperdink and did nothing all day but gather faggots. Her face was long and lean, her hair thin and black, and her nose so large that it made you think of a cauliflower. "Ugh!" groaned Prince Pompadore, falling back on Kabumpo for support. "Well, she's a princess and a fairy, the only one in any kingdom." "I don't see why you want to be so fussy," said the king fretfully. "Shall I tell her Royal Highness of the great good fortune that has befallen her?" asked the Prime Pumper, starting for the door. "Do so at once," snapped Pompous. Just then he gave a scream of fright and pain, for a round, shiny object had flown through the air and struck him on the head. "What was that?" The Prime Pumper looked suspiciously at the elegant elephant. Kabumpo glared back. "Hey, a warning," stuttered the Prime Pumper, afraid to say that Kabumpo had flung the offending missile. "A warning, your majesty." "It's nothing of the kind," said the king angrily. "You're getting old, Pumper, and stupid. Why, it's a doorknob. Who dares to hit me with a doorknob?" "It hit me once," mumbled Kabumpo, shifting uneasily from one foot to the other. 3. "How does it strike you?" "As an outrageous piece of impertinence," spluttered Pompous, turning as red as a turkey cock. "Perhaps it has something to do with the scroll," suggested Queen Posy, taking it from the king. "See, it is gold, and all the doorknobs in the palace are ivory. And look, here are some initials." Sure enough, it was gold, and in the very center were the initials P.A.A. Just at this interesting juncture, the page, who had been poking his head in the door every few minutes, gathered his courage together and rushed up to the king. "Pardon, Most High Highness, but General Quakes bade me say that this mirror was found under the window," stuttered the page, and before Pompous had an opportunity to cry, "Begone!" or "Dip him!" the little fellow made a dash for the door and disappeared. "It grows more puzzling every minute," wailed the king, looking from the doorknob to the mirror and from the mirror to the scroll. "If you take my advice, you'll have this marriage performed at once," said the Prime Pumper in a trembling voice. "I believe I will," sighed Pompous, rubbing the bump on his head. "Go and fetch the Princess Faliro, and you, Pompa, prepare for your wedding." "But father," began the prince. "Not another word, or you'll be dipped," rumbled the King of Pumperdink. "I'm not going to have my kingdom disappearing if I can help it." "You mean if I can help it," muttered Pompadore gloomily. "This is ridiculous." stormed the elegant elephant as the prime pumper rushed importantly out of the room. "Don't you know that this country of ours is only a small part of the great kingdom of Oz? There must be hundreds of princesses for Pompadore to choose from. Why should he not wed Ozma, the princess of us all? Haven't you read any Oz history? Have you never heard of the wonderful Emerald City? Let Pompadore start out at once. I myself will accompany him, and if Ozma refuses to marry him, well, the elegant elephant drew himself up. I will carry her off, that's all." "It's a long way to the Emerald City," mused Queen Posy, "but still. Yes, and what is to become of us in the meantime, pray? While you are wandering all over Oz, we can disappear, I suppose." "No, sir! Not one step do you go out of Pumperdink. Faleero is the proper princess, and Pompadore shall marry her," said Pompous. "You're talking through your crown," wheezed Kabumpo. "How about the doorknob and mirror? They came out of the cake as well as the scroll. What are you going to do about them? Let's have a look at that mirror." "Just a common gold mirror," fumed Pompous, holding it up for the elegant elephant to see. "What's the matter?" as Kabumpo gave a snort. On the face of the mirror, as Kabumpo looked in, 2 words appeared, "Elegant Elephant," and when Pompous snatched the mirror, above his reflection stood the words, "Fat Old King." Then Queen Posy peeped into the mirror, which promptly flashed, "Lovely Queen!" "Why, it's telling the truth!" screamed Pompa, looking over his mother's shoulder. At this, the words, "Charming Prince," formed quickly in the glass. The prince grinned at his father, who was now quite beside himself with rage. "You think I'm fat and old, do you?" snorted the king, flinging the gold mirror face down on the table. "This is a nice day, I must say. Scrolls, doorknobs, mirrors, and insults." "But what can P.A. stand for?" mused Queen Posy thoughtfully. "Plain enough," chuckled Kabumpo maliciously. "It stands for perfectly awful." "Who's perfectly awful?" asked Pompous suspiciously. "Why, Faleero," sniffed the elegant elephant. "That's plain enough to everybody." "Dip him," shrieked Pompous. "I've had enough of this. Dip him. Do you hear?" "That," yawned Kabumpo, straightening his silk robe, "is impossible." And, considering his size, it was. But just that minute the Prime Pumper returned, and in his interest to hear what the Princess Faleero had said, the king forgot about dipping Kabumpo. The courier from the princess stepped forward. "Her Highness," puffed the Prime Pumper, who had run all the way, "Her Highness accepts Prince Pompadore with pleasure and will marry him tomorrow morning." Prince Pompadore gave a dismal groan. "Fine," cried the king, rubbing his hands together. "Let everything be made ready for the ceremony, and in the meantime—" Pompous glared about fiercely. "I forbid anyone's disappearing." "I am still the king." "Set a guard around the castle, Pumper, to watch for any signs of disappearance, and if so much as a fence paling disappears," he drew himself up, "notify me at once." Then turning to the throne, Pompous gave his arm to Queen Posy, and together they started for the garden. "Do you mean to say you are going to pay no attention to the mirror or doorknob?" cried Kabumpo, planting himself in the king's path. "Go away," said Pompous crossly. "Oyez! Oyez!" "Way for their majesties!" cried the Prime Pumper, running ahead with his silver staff, and the royal couple swept out of the banquet hall. "Never mind, Kabumpo," said the prince, flinging his arm affectionately around the elegant elephant's trunk. "I dare say Faleero has her good points, and we cannot let the old kingdom disappear, you know." "Fiddlesticks!" choked Kabumpo. "She'll make a doormat of you, Pompa. Prince Pompadore, that's what you'll be. Let's run away," he proposed, his little eyes twinkling anxiously. "I couldn't do that and let the kingdom disappear. It wouldn't be right," sighed the prince, and sadly he followed his parents into the royal gardens. "The king's a gooch," gulped the elegant elephant unhappily. Then, all at once, he flung up his trunk. Somebody's going to disappear around here, he wheezed darkly. That's certain! With a mighty rustling of his silk robe, Kabumpo hurried off to his own royal quarters in the palace. Left alone, Prince Pompa threw himself down at the foot of the throne and gazed sadly into space. Chapter 3. Kabumpo and Pompa disappear. Once in his own apartment, Kabumpo pulled the bell rope furiously. My pearls and my purple plush robe. Bring them at once, he puffed when his personal attendant appeared in the doorway. Yes, sir. Are you going out, sir? Murmured the little Pumperdinkian, hastening to a great chest in the corner of the big marble room to get out of the robe. Not unless disappearing is going out, said Kabumpo more mildly, for he was quite fond of this little man who waited on him. But I'm liable to disappear any minute. So are you. So is everybody, and I, for my part, wish to do the thing well and disappear with as much elegance as possible. Have you heard about the magic scroll, Spezzle? Yes, sir, quavered Spezzle, mounting a ladder to adjust the elegant elephant's pearls and gorgeous robe of state. Yes, sir, and my head's going round and round like— Like what? Asked Kabumpo, looking approvingly at his reflection in the long mirror. I can't rightly say, sir, sighed Spezzle. This disappearing has me that mixed up I don't know what I'm doing. Well, don't start by losing your head, chuckled Kabumpo. There, that will do very well. He lifted the little man down from the ladder. Goodbye, Spezzle. If you should disappear before I should see you again, try to do it in style. Yes, sir, gulped Spezzle. Then, taking out a bright red handkerchief, he blew his nose violently and rushed out of the room. Kabumpo walked up and down before the mirror, surveying himself from all angles. A very gorgeous appearance he presented in his purple plush robe of state, all embroidered in silver, and his head bands of shining pearls. In the left side of his robe there was a deep pocket. Into this the elegant elephant slipped all the jewels he possessed, taking them from a drawer in the chest. I must get that gold doorknob, he rumbled thoughtfully. And the mirror. Noiselessly, for all his tremendous size, Kabumpo could move without a sound. He made his way back to the banquet hall and loomed up suddenly behind the prime pumper. The old fellow was staring with popping eyes into the gold mirror. Ho, ho, roared Kabumpo. Ho, ho, Kerumph, no wonder. Above the shocked reflection of the foolish statesman stood the words, Old goose, a truthful mirror indeed, wheezed the elegant elephant. Eh? What? Stuttered the prime pumper, slapping the mirror down on the table in a hurry. Where'd you come from? What are you all dressed up for? For my disappearance, said Kabumpo, sweeping the doorknob and mirror into his pocket. I'm getting ready to disappear. How do I look? Before the prime pumper had time to answer, the elegant elephant was gone. Back in his own room, Kabumpo paced impatiently up and down, waiting for night. I do not see how she could refuse us, he mumbled every now and then to himself. That was an anxious afternoon and evening in the palace of Pumperdink. Every few minutes the courtiers felt themselves nervously to see if they were still there. The servants went about on tiptoe, looking fearfully over their shoulders for the first signs of disappearance. As it grew darker, the gates and windows were securely barred and not a candle was lighted. The less the castle shows, the less likely it is to disappear, reasoned the king. The darkness suited Kabumpo. He waited until everyone in the palace had retired and a full hour longer. Then he stepped softly down the passage to the prince's apartment. Pompadore, without undressing, had flung himself upon a couch and fallen into an uneasy slumber. Without making a sound, Kabumpo took the prince's crown from a dressing cabinet, slipped it carefully into the pocket of his robe, and then carefully lifted the sleeping prince in his curling trunk and started cautiously down the great hall. Setting him gently on the floor as he reached the palace doors, he pushed back the golden bolts and stepped out into the garden. The voices of the watchmen calling to each other from the great wall came faintly through the darkness, but the elegant elephant hurried to a secret unguarded entrance known only to himself and Pompadore, and passed like a great shadow through the swinging gates. Once outside, he swung the sleeping prince to his broad back and ran swiftly and silently through the night. "What are we doing?" murmured the prince drowsily in his sleep. "Disappearing," chuckled Kabumpo under his breath. "Disappearing from Pumperdink, my lad." Chapter 4. The Curious Cottabus Appears. "Ouch!" Prince Pompadore stirred uneasily and rolled over. "Ouch!" he groaned again, giving his pillow a fretful thump. "Ouch!" This time his eyes flew wide open, for his knuckles were tingling with pain. "A rock!" gasped the prince, sitting up indignantly. "A rock under my head! No wonder it aches! Great Gillikens! Where am I?" He stared about wildly. There was not a familiar object in sight. Indeed, he was in a dim, deep forest, and from the distance came the sound of someone sawing wood. Oh, I know," muttered the prince, rubbing his head miserably. "It's that wretched scroll. I've disappeared, and this is the place I've disappeared to." Stiffly he got to his feet and started to walk in the direction of the sawing, but had only gone a few steps before he gave a cry of joy, for there, leaning up against a tree, snoring like 20 woodcutters at work, was Kabumpo. "Wake up!" cried Pompadore, pounding him with all his might. "Wake up, Kabumpo! We've disappeared!" "Have we?" yawned the elegant elephant, opening one eye. "You don't say? Ho, 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 ho!" With a tremendous yawn, he opened the other eye and began to chuckle and shake all over. "We stole a march on him, Pompa. I'd like to see the king's face when he finds us gone. Old Pumper will be oyezing all over the palace. He'll think we've disappeared by magic." "Well, didn't we?" asked Pompadore in amazement. "Not unless you call me magic. I carried you off in the night. Did you suppose old Kabumpo was going to stand quietly by while they married you to a faggoty old fairy like Faliro?" "Not much," wheezed the elegant elephant. "I have other plans for you, little one." "But this is terrible!" cried the prince, catching hold of a tree. "Here you have left my poor old father, my lovely mother, and the whole kingdom of Pumperdink to disappear. We'll have to go right straight back to Pumperdink. Do you hear? Do have a little sense." Kabumpo shook himself crossly. "You can't save them by going back. The thing to do is to go forward, find the proper princess, and marry her. No scroll magic takes effect for 7 days anyway." "How do you know?" asked Pompa anxiously. "Read it in a witch book," answered Kabumpo promptly. "Now, that gives us plenty of time to go to the Emerald City and present ourselves to the lovely ruler of Oz. There's a proper princess for you, Pompa. But suppose she refuses me," said the prince uncertainly. "You're very handsome, Pompa, my boy." The elegant elephant gave the prince a playful poke with his trunk. "I've brought all my jewels as gifts and the magic mirror and doorknob as well. If she refuses you, and the worst comes to the worst." Kabumpo cleared his throat gravely. "Well, just leave it to me." After a bit more coaxing, and after eating the breakfast Kabumpo had thoughtfully brought along, Pompa allowed the elegant elephant to lift him on his head, and off they set at Kabumpo's best speed for the Emerald City of Oz. Neither the prince nor the elegant elephant had ever been out of Pumperdink, but Kabumpo had found an old map of Oz in the palace library. According to this map, the Emerald City lay directly to the south of their own country. "So all we have to do is to keep going south," chuckled Kabumpo softly. Pompadore nodded, but he was trying to recall the exact words of the mysterious scroll. "Know ye, that unless ye prince of ye ancient and honorable kingdom of Pumperdink shall wed ye, proper fairy princess in ye proper span of time, ye kingdom of Pumperdink shall disappear forever and even longer from ye Gillikin country of Oz." J.G. Pompadore repeated the words solemnly, then fell a-thinking of all he had heard of Ozma of Oz, the loveliest little fairy imaginable. "She wouldn't want one of her kingdom to disappear," reflected Pompadore sagely. Now, as it happened, Ozma did not even know of the existence of Pumperdink. Oz is so large and inhabited by so many strange and singular peoples that although 14 books of history have been written about it, only half the story has been told. There are no Oz railway or steamship lines, and traveling is tedious and slow, owing to the magic nature of the land itself, its many mountains and fairy forests, so that Pumperdink, like many of the small kingdoms on the outskirts of Oz, has never been explored by Ozma. Oz itself is a huge, oblong country divided into 4 parts, the north being the purple Gillikin country, the east the blue Munchkin country, the south the red lands of the Quadlings, and the west the pleasant yellow country of the Winkies. In the very center of Oz, as almost every boy and girl knows, is the wonderful Emerald City, and in its gorgeous green palace lives Ozma, the lovely little fairy princess whom Kabumpo wanted Pompadore to marry. "Do you know," mused the prince after they had traveled some time through the dim forest, "I believe that gold mirror has a lot to do with all this. I believe it was put in the cake to help me find the proper princess." "Where would you find a more proper princess than Ozma?" puffed Kabumpo indignantly. "Ozma is the one. Depend upon it." "Just the same," said Pompa firmly, "I'm going to try every princess we meet." "Do you expect to find 'em running wild in the woods?" snorted Kabumpo, who didn't like to be contradicted. "You never can tell." The Prince of Pumperdink settled back comfortably. Now that they were really started, he was finding traveling extremely interesting. "I should have done this long ago," murmured the prince to himself. "Every prince should go on a journey of adventure." "How long will it take us to reach the Emerald City?" he asked presently. 2 days, if nothing happens," answered Kabumpo. "Say, what's that?" He stopped short and spread his ears till they looked like sails. The underbrush at the right was crackling from the springs of some large animal, and next minute a hoarse voice roared, "I want to know the which and what, the where and how and why." "A curious, luxurious old cottabus am I. I want to know the when and who, the what for, and why so, sir. So please attend, there is no end to things I want to know, sir." "Aha!" exulted the voice triumphantly. "There you are!" And a great round head was thrust out, almost in Kabumpo's face. "Oh, I'm going to enjoy this." "Don't move!" Kabumpo was too astonished to move, and the next instant the cottabus had flounced out of the bushes and settled itself directly in front of the 2 travelers. It was large as a pony, but shaped like a great overfed cat. Its eyes bulged unpleasantly, and the end of its tail ended in a large fan. "Well," grunted Kabumpo after the strange creature had regarded them for a full minute without blinking. "Well, what?" it asked, beginning to fan itself sulkily. "You act as if you had never seen a cottabus before." "We never have," admitted Pompa, peering over Kabumpo's head and secretly wishing he had brought along his jeweled sword. "Why haven't you?" asked the cottabus, rolling up its eyes. "How frightfully ignorant!" It closed its fantail with a snap and looked up at them disapprovingly. "Will you kindly tell me who you are, where you came from, when you came, what you are going for, how you are going to get it, why you are going, and what you are going to do when you do get it?" "I don't see why we should tell you all that," grumbled Kabumpo. "It's none of your affair." "Wrong!" shrieked the creature hysterically. "It is the business of a cottabus to find out everything." "I live on other people's affairs, and unless," here it paused, took a large handkerchief out of a pocket in its fur and began to wipe its eyes. "Unless a cottabus asks 50 questions a day, it curls up in its porch rocker and DDDs, and this is my 5th questionless day." "Curl up and die, then," said Kabumpo gruffly. But the kind-hearted prince felt sorry for the foolish creature. "If we answer your questions, will you answer ours?" "I'll try," sniffed the curious cottabus, and leaning over it dragged a rocking chair out of the bushes and seated itself comfortably. "Well then," began Pompa, "this is the Elegant Elephant, and I am a prince. We came from Pumperdink because our kingdom was threatened with disappearance unless I marry a proper princess." "Yes," murmured the cottabus, rocking violently. Yes, and we are going to the Emerald City to ask Princess Ozma for her hand," continued the prince. "How do you know she is the one? When did this happen? Who brought the message? What are you going to do if Ozma refuses you?" asked the cottabus, leaning forward breathlessly. "Are you going to stand talking to this ridiculous creature all day?" grumbled Kabumpo. But Pompadore, perhaps because he was so young, felt flattered that even a curious old cottabus should take such an interest in his affairs. So, beginning at the very beginning, he told the whole story of his birthday party. Yes, gulped the cottabus wildly each time the prince paused for breath. Yes, fluttering its fan excitedly. When Pompadore had finished, the cottabus leaned back, closed its eyes, and put both paws on the arms of the rocker. "I never heard anything more curious in my life," said the curious one. "This will keep me amused for 3 days. Of course, that's what we're here for, to amuse you," said Kabumpo scornfully. "Let's be going, Pompa. Perhaps the curious cottabus can tell us something of the country ahead. Are there any princesses living round here?" the prince asked eagerly. "Never heard of any," said the cottabus, opening its eyes. "Can you multiply, add, divide, and subtract? Are you good at fractions, Prince?" "Not very," admitted Pompadore, looking mystified. "Then you won't make much headway," sighed the cottabus, shaking its head solemnly. "Now, don't ask me why," it added lugubriously, dragging its rocker back into the brush, and while Kabumpo and Pompa stared in amazement, it wriggled away into the bushes. "Come on!" cried Kabumpo with a contemptuous grunt, but he had only gone a few steps when the curious cottabus stuck its head out of an opening in the trees just ahead. "When are you coming back?" it asked, twitching its nose anxiously. "Never!" trumpeted Kabumpo, increasing his speed. Again the cottabus disappeared, only to reappear at the first turn in the road. "Did you say the doorknob hit you on the head?" it asked pleadingly. Kabumpo gave a snort of anger and rushed along so fast that Pompa had to hang on for dear life. "Guess we've left him behind this time," spluttered the Elegant Elephant, after he had run almost a mile. But at that minute there was a wheeze from the underbrush, and the head of the cottabus was thrust out. Its tongue was hanging out, and it was panting with exhaustion. "How old are you?" it gasped, rolling its eyes pitifully. "Who was your grandfather on your father's side, and was he bald?" "Carumberty Bumpus," raged the Elegant Elephant, flouncing to the other side of the road. "But why was the doorknob in the cake?" gulped the cottabus, 2 tears trickling off its nose. "How should we know?" said Pompa coldly. "Then just tell me the date of your birth," wailed the cottabus, 2 tears trickling off its nose. "No! No!" screamed Kabumpo, and this time he ran so fast that the tearful voice of the cottabus became fainter and fainter and finally died away altogether. "Provokingest creature I've ever met," grumbled the Elegant Elephant, and this time Pompa agreed with him. "Isn't it almost lunchtime?" asked the prince. He was beginning to feel terribly hungry. "And aren't there any villages or cities between here and the Emerald City?" Pompa spoke again. "Don't know," wheezed Kabumpo, swinging ahead. "Oh, there's a flag!" cried Pumpa suddenly. "It's flying above the treetops just ahead." And so it was, a huge, flapping black flag covered with hundreds of figures and signs. "Hurry up, Kabumpo," urged the prince. "This looks interesting." Chapter 5. "In the city of the figureheads, it reminds me of something disagreeable," answered Kabumpo as he eyed the flag. Nevertheless, he quickened his steps, and in a moment they came to a clearing in the forest, surrounded by a tall black picket fence. The only thing visible above the fence was the strange black flag. And as the forest on either side was too dense to penetrate and there seemed to be no way around, Kabumpo thumped loudly on the center gate. It was flung open at once, so suddenly that Kabumpo, who had his head pressed against the bars, fell on his knees and shot Pompadore clear over his head. Altogether it was a very undignified entrance. "Oh, oh, now we shall have some fun," screamed a high, thin voice, and immediately the cry was taken up by hundreds of other voices. A perfect swarm of strange creatures surrounded the two travelers. The elegant elephant took one look, put back his ears, and snatched Pompa from the paving stones. "Stop that!" he rumbled threateningly. "Who are you, anyway?" The crowd paid no attention to the elegant elephant's question, but continued to dance up and down and scream with glee. Clutching Kabumpo's ear, Pompa peered down with many misgivings. They were entirely surrounded by thin, spry little people who had figures instead of heads, and the 4s, 8s, 7s, and ciphers bobbing up and down made it terribly confusing. "Let's go," said Pompa, who was growing dizzier every minute. But the and they were shouting so lustily that the elegant elephant's voice was drowned in the hubbub. Finally, Kabumpo's eyes began to snap angrily, and, taking a deep breath, he threw up his trunk and trumpeted like 50 ferryboat whistles. The effect was immediate and astonishing. Half of the figureheads fell on their faces, and the other half fell on their backs and stared vacantly up at the sky. "Conduct us to your ruler," roared Kabumpo, in the dead silence that followed. "How'd you know we had a ruler?" asked a 7, getting cautiously to its feet. "Most countries have," said the elegant elephant shortly. "He's got no right to order us around," said a 6, sitting up and jerking its thumb at Kabumpo. "Yes, but—" 7 frowned at 6 and put his hands over his ears. "This way," he said gruffly, and Kabumpo, stepping carefully for many of the— If the inhabitants of this strange city were queer, their city was even more so. The air was dry and choky, and the houses were dull, oblong affairs, set in rows and rows with never a garden in sight. Each street had a large signpost on the corner, but they were not like the signs one usually sees in cities, for these were plus and minus signs with here and there a long division sign. "I suppose everything in this street's divided up," mumbled Pompadore, looking up at a division sign curiously. "Hope they don't subtract any of our belongings," whispered Kabumpo as they turned into Minus Alley. "Look, Pompa, at the houses." "Ever see anything like 'em before? They remind me of something disagreeable," mused the prince. "Why, they're books, Kabumpo, great big arithmetic books." Pompa pointed at one. "You mean they are shaped like books," said the elegant elephant. "I never saw books with windows and doors." "A lot you know," said 7, looking back scornfully, but Kabumpo was too interested to care. Out of the windows of the big book houses leaped hundreds of the little figureheads, and they laughed and jeered at Pompa and Kabumpo. "Ho! Ho!" yelled one, leaning out so far it nearly fell on its 8. "Wait till the Count sees 'em. He'll make an example of 'em." "What an awful country," whispered Pompadore, ducking just in time as a 4 snatched at his hair from an open window. But just then they turned a corner and entered a large, gloomy court. Sitting on a square and solid wood throne, surrounded by a guard of figureheads, sat the giant ruler of this strange city. "What have you got there, 7?" roared the ruler. I am the Elegant Elephant, and this is the Prince of Pumperdink, announced Kabumpo before Seven could answer. Pompadore himself could say nothing, for he had never before been addressed by a wooden ruler in his life. And that is exactly what the king of the figureheads was. An ordinary school ruler, twice as large as a man, with arms and legs and a great square head set atop of his thin, flat body. I don't care a rap who you are. I want to know what you are, said the ruler. We are travelers, spoke up Pompa, swallowing hard. Travelers in search of a proper princess. Well, you won't find any here, grunted the ruler shortly. We don't believe in 'em. Would you mind telling me the name of your kingdom? Asked Pompa, somewhat cast down by these words. You have no heads, announced the ruler calmly, or you would have known that this is arithmetic. I, he hammered himself upon the wooden chest, I am its ruler, and every inch a king. King of the figureheads, he added, glaring around as if he expected someone to contradict him. All right, wheezed Kabumpo, bowing his head twice. I knew 12 inches made a foot rule, but I never knew they made a king rule. But could you give us some luncheon and allow us to pass peaceably through your kingdom? Pass through, exclaimed the king, standing up indignantly. We don't pass anyone through here. You've got to work your way through. Pass through, indeed. And when you've worked your way through, we'll put you in a problem and make an example of you. They'll make a very good example, your majesty, said a tall, thin individual standing next to the ruler. He eyed the two cunningly. If a thin prince sets out on a fat elephant to find a proper princess, how many yards of fringe will the elephant lose from his robe, and how bald will the prince be at the end of the journey? I don't believe anyone could figure that out, he murmured gleefully. It might be done by subtraction, said the king, looking at the two critically. Great haystacks, rumbled Kabumpo, glaring over his shoulder to see if he had lost any fringe so far. What have we gotten into? Bald, gulped Pompa, rubbing his head. Do you mean to say you take poor innocent travelers and make them into arithmetic problems? Why not? Said the thin one, who looked exactly like a giant lead pencil. And please address me as Count after this. Count it up is my name. What's the matter with living in a problem, my boy? Life is a problem after all, and you will get used to it in time. I'll try to assign you to a comfortable book, and you'll find bookkeeping a lot more simple than housekeeping. This way, please. Please go, yawned the ruler, waving his hand. The Count will take you in charge now. And so dazed was the elegant elephant by all this strange reasoning that he tamely followed the lead pencil person. Goodbye, shouted the ruler hoarsely. Start them on simple additions, he said as they moved off. The street ahead was filled with figureheads, and as Kabumpo paused they began forming themselves into sums. The first row sat down, the next knelt behind them, the third stood up, the fourth nimbly leaped upon the shoulders of the third, and so on, until a long addition confronted the travelers. Now, said Count It, up in his blunt way, as you haven't figures for heads, let us see if you have heads for figures. Kabumpo pushed back his pearl headdress, and drops of perspiration began to run down his trunk. Prince Pompa, lying flat on Kabumpo's head, started to add up the 83, he announced anxiously. Say 3 and 8 to carry, snapped Count It Up. Here, 3. A 3 stepped out of the crowd and placed itself under the line. I've got to be carried, cried 8, looking sulkily at Pompa. Carried, snorted Kabumpo, snatching 8 into the air. Well, I'll attend to you. You do the adding, Pompa, and I'll do the carrying. He landed the 8-head down at the bottom of the line of figureheads and swung his trunk carelessly while he waited for his next victim. So, slowly and painfully, Pompa counted up the long lines, and Kabumpo carried, and if they made the slightest mistake, the figureheads shouted with scorn and danced about till the confusion was terrible. When an example was finished, the figureheads in it marched away, but another would immediately form lines ahead so that it took them a whole hour to go 2 blocks. "Oh," groaned Pumpa at last, "we'll never get through this, Kabumpo. Look at those awful fractions ahead. Can't I skip fractions?" he asked, looking pleadingly at Count It Up. "Certainly not," said the pencilly man, stroking his shiny hair, which was straight and black and grew up into a sharp point. "You shall skip nothing." "That gives me an idea," whispered Kabumpo huskily. "Why shouldn't we skip altogether? We're bigger than they are." "Why, how are you getting on?" At the sound of that hoarse, familiar voice, both the prince and Kabumpo jumped. "You don't mind me asking, I hope?" Clinging to the high picket fence and looking anxiously through the bars was the curious Cottabus. "Have you found the greatest common divisor yet?" "Who's he?" asked the Elegant Elephant suspiciously. "Isn't there any way out of arithmetic but this?" wailed Pompa, looking at the Cottabus pleadingly. He was too tired to mind being questioned. The curious beast was delighted to have this new opportunity to talk to the travelers. "Will you answer a few questions if I tell you?" asked the Cottabus, raising itself with great difficulty and looking over the palings. "Yes, yes, anything," promised Pompa. "Do you care for strawberry tarts?" asked the Cottabus, twitching its nose very rapidly. "Of course," said the prince. "Oh, do hurry. Count It Up will be back in a moment." He had run ahead to arrange a new problem in the rest of the palings. "Are you going to invite the Scarecrow to your wedding?" gulped the Cottabus. "I don't know any Scarecrow," said Pompa, "so how could I?" "Are you fond of that old elephant?" The Cottabus waved at Kabumpo, who stamped first one foot then another, and fairly snorted with rage. "All right," sighed the curious Cottabus. "That makes my 50 questions." Hanging on to the fence with one paw, it waved the other backward and forward as it chanted, "How many ticks in arithmetic?" "Tell me that, and tell me quick. But if you can't, it's not my fault, so simply turn a wintersault." The head of the Cottabus disappeared. "Now, isn't that provoking?" gulped the prince. "After it promised to help us, too." "I meant somersault," wheezed the Cottabus, reappearing suddenly. "And if you can't, it's not your fault, so simply turn a somersault," it recited dolefully, and losing its balance fell off the fence and landed with a thud on the ground below. "Here, hurry along," scolded Count It Up, prodding Kabumpo with a sharp pencil. "The next is a nice little problem in fractions." "I wonder if it meant anything," mused Pompadore as Kabumpo approached the new problem. "If you can't, it's not your fault, so simply turn a somersault. Anyway, it wouldn't hurt to try. Stop a minute, Kabumpo." Sliding down the Elegant Elephant's trunk, the prince put his head on the ground and very carefully and deliberately turned a somersault. At his first motion, Count It Up gave a deafening scream, fell on his head and broke off his point, while the figureheads began to run in every direction. "Do it again! Do it again!" cried Kabumpo joyfully. So Pompa turned another somersault, and another, and another, and another, till not a houses tumbled out and dashed madly around the corner. Before they could return, Kabumpo snatched up Pompa and tore through the deserted streets of Arithmetic till he came to the black iron gate at the other end of the city. Butting it open with his head, the Elegant Elephant dashed through and never stopped running till he was miles away from there. "Have to rest a bit and eat some leaves," puffed Kabumpo at last, slowing down. "Wah! Wish I could eat leaves," sighed the prince as Kabumpo began lunching off the treetops. "But never mind, we're out of arithmetic. Wasn't it lucky that Cottabus followed us? I never would have thought of getting out of sums by somersaulting. Would you?" "Only sensible thing it ever said, probably," answered the Elegant Elephant with his mouth full of leaves. "There's a lot more to be learned by traveling than by studying, my boy. Somersaults for sums. Let's always remember that." Pompa did not answer. He slid down Kabumpo's trunk and began hunting anxiously around for something to eat. Not far away, he found a large nut tree, and, gathering a handful of nuts, he sat down and began to crack them on a white marble slab nearby. Next instant, Kabumpo heard a thud and a muffled cry. The Prince of Pumperdink had vanished, as if by magic. "Where are you?" screamed the elegant elephant, pounding through the brush. "Pompa! Pompa! He's disappeared!" gasped Kabumpo, rushing over to the marble slab. There was not a sign of the royal Prince of Pumperdink anywhere, but carved carefully on the white stone were these words, "Please knock before you fall in." "Fall in?" snorted Kabumpo, his eyes rolling wildly. "Great Gooch!" Chapter 6. Rugido's History in 6 Rocks. On the same night that Prince Pompa and Kabumpo had disappeared from Pumperdink, a little gray gnome crouched in a deep chamber, tunneled under the Emerald City, laboriously carving letters on a big rock. It was Rugido, the old gnome king, carving and grumbling and grumbling and carving, and pausing every few minutes to light his pipe with a hot coal which he kept in his pocket for that purpose. A big emerald lamp cast a green glow over the strange cavern and made the gnome look like a bad green goblin, which he was. "Wag!" screamed the gnome, suddenly throwing down his chisel. "Where are you, you long-eared villain?" There was a slight stir at the back of the cave, and a rabbit, of about the same size as the gnome, shuffled slowly forward. "What you want?" he asked, rubbing one eye with his paw. "Bring me a cup of melted mud, idiot," roared the gnome, pounding on the rock, "and serve it to me on my throne at once." "Now, see here." The rabbit twitched his nose rapidly. "I'll get you a cup of melted mud, but don't you call me an idiot. I don't mind working for one, nor digging for one and listening to his foolishness, but nobody can call me an idiot, not even a make-believe king." "Oh, you make me tired," fumed the gnome. "Then go to sleep," advised the rabbit with a yawn. "What's the use of trying to pretend you're a king, Rug? Ho, ho, king over one wooden doll, 6 rocks and 27 sofa cushions. You may have been a king once, but now you're just a plain gnome and nothing else, and if you go and sit quietly in your plain rocking chair, I'll bring you a cup of plain mud." With a chuckle, the rabbit retired, and Rugido, spluttering with fury, flounced into a doll's broken rocker that was set in the exact center of the cave. "Here, I give that rabbit everything I steal, and he won't even allow me the little luxury of calling him an idiot or of pulling his ears." "How can I pretend to be a king without an ear to pull?" grumbled the gnome. "What are you grinning at?" Bouncing out of his chair, Rugido flew at a merry-faced wooden doll who sat propped up against the wall and shook her till her head turned round backwards and her arms and legs flew every which way. Then he hurled her violently into a corner. Quite out of breath, he sank back in his chair and stared angrily about. When Wag returned, the gnome snatched the tin cup of melted mud and tossed it down with one gulp. Then, flinging the cup at the doll, he went back to work. The rabbit shook his head mournfully and, picking up the wooden doll, straightened her out and placed her on a cushion. Then, yawning again, he lit a candle and started for the passage at the back of the cave. "How are you getting on?" he asked, pausing to look over the gnome's shoulder with a grin. "Fine," answered Rugido, forgetting to scowl. "I'm up to the 6th rock and expect to finish tonight." "Who do you think will read it?" asked the rabbit, putting back both ears and stroking his whiskers. Then he gave a great spring, just escaped the chisel Rugido had flung at his head, and pattered away into the darkness. For several minutes the gnome danced up and down with fury. Then, as there was no one to pinch or shake, he started to work harder than ever on the 6th rock of his history. There were 6 of the great stones set in a row on one side of the cavern, and the carving on them had taken the old gnome king the best part of 2 years. The letters were crooked and roughly chiseled, but quite readable. On the history of Ruggedo in 6 Rocks, Ruggedo the Rough, king of the gnomes, one time metal monarch, at other times a limoneg, a goose, a nut, and now a common gnome by order of Ozma of Oz. The 2nd rock told of Ruggedo's magnificent kingdom under the mountains of Ev, of the thousands of gnomes he had ruled, and the great treasure of precious gems he had possessed, in those good old days before he was banished from his dominions. The 3rd rock told of his transformation of the Queen of Ev and her children into ornaments for his palace, and of their rescue by a party from Oz through the cleverness of Billina, a yellow hen. It told of the loss of his magic belt, which was captured at this same time by Dorothy, a little girl from Kansas. The 4th rock related how Ruggedo had tried to conquer Oz and recover his belt, how all of his plans failed, and how he tumbled into the fountain of oblivion and forgot all about his campaign. The 5th rock had taken Ruggedo the longest to carve, for it gave the story of his banishment by the great Jinn Titihuchu. You have probably read this story yourself. How Tick-Tock, Betsy Bobbin, Shaggy Man, and Polychrome, trying to find Shaggy's brother hidden in the Gnome King's metal forest, were thrown down a long tube to the other side of the world, and how the owner of the tube sent Quox the dragon to punish Ruggedo by banishment from his kingdom, and how Kaliko was made king of the gnomes. The 6th rock told of Ruggedo's last attempt to capture Oz. Meeting Kiki Aru, a Hyup boy who knew a magic transformation word, Ruggedo suggested that they change themselves to limonigs, queer beasts with lion heads, monkey tails, and eagle wings, get all the beasts of Oz to help and march on the Emerald City. But this plan failed, too. Kiki lost his temper and changed Ruggedo to a goose. The Wizard of Oz discovered the magic word and changed both the conspirators to nuts. Later on, they were changed back to their normal shapes, but again Ruggedo was plunged into the fountain of oblivion and again forgot his wicked plans. This ended the rock history except for a short sentence stating that Ruggedo now lived in the Emerald City. But the magic of the Fountain of Oblivion had soon worn off, and it was not long before Ruggedo began to remember his past wickedness. That is why he decided to carve his life story in rock, so that it would be handy should he ever fall into the forgetful fountain again. And it had taken 6 rocks to tell all of his adventures. He had not carved these stories just as they had happened, nor ever called himself wicked, but he had told most of the facts, leaving out the parts most unflattering to himself. And now it was finished, his whole history in 6 rocks. Throwing down his chisel for the last time, Ruggedo straightened up and regarded his work with glowing pride. I don't believe there's another history like this in all Oz, puffed the gnome, tugging at his silver beard. It's a good thing, chuckled Wag, who had come back to eat a carrot. Oz would not be a very happy place if there were many folks like you. He seated himself quietly on the 1st rock of Ruggedo's history and began nibbling his carrot. Get up! How dare you sit on my history? Ruggedo stamped his foot and started threateningly toward Wog. All right, said the rabbit. It's too hard, anyway. Of course it's hard, stormed Ruggedo. I've had a hard life, hard as those rocks. Everybody's been against me from the very start, and all because I'm so little, he finished bitterly. No, because you are so wicked, said the rabbit calmly. Now, don't throw your pipe at me, for you know it's the truth. Ruggedo glared at the rabbit for a minute, then rushed over to the wooden doll and began shaking her furiously. He always vented his rage on the wooden doll. Stop that, screamed Wag, or I'll leave upon the spot. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, you old Scrabble-Scratch. She's not alive, snapped Ruggedo sulkily. How do you know? Retorted the rabbit. Anyway, she's a jolly creature. I'm not going to have her banged around. Here you've taken her away from her little mother, and she hasn't even anyone to rock her to sleep." "I'll rock her to sleep," screamed Ruggedo maliciously, and flinging the doll on the floor he began hurling small rocks at the helpless little figure. Scrambling to his feet, Wag rescued the wooden doll again, and Ruggedo, who really was afraid the rabbit would leave him, subsided into his rocking chair. Then reaching up to a small shelf over his head, he pulled down an accordion. At the first doleful wheeze, Wag gave a great hop, dropped Peg, and disappeared into his room in the farthest corner of the cave. After his last attempt to capture Oz, the gnome had been given a small cottage to live in, just outside the Emerald City. But Ruggedo could not bear life above ground. The sunlight hurt his eyes, and the contented, happy faces of the people hurt his feelings, for he was exactly what Wag had called him, an old Scrabble-Scratch. So, while he pretended to live in the little cottage, according to Ozma's orders, he really spent most of his time in this deep, dark cave. He entered it by a secret passage opening from his cellar. Digging the long passage had been the hardest work Ruggedo had ever done in his bad little life. While toiling one day, he had bumped into the underground burrow of Wag, a wandering rabbit of Oz, and after a deal of bargaining, the rabbit had agreed to help him. Wag was to receive a ruby a month for his services, for the gnome still had a large bag of precious stones which he had brought from the old kingdom. After the bargain with Wag was made, the passage progressed rapidly, for the rabbit was an expert digger. It was Ruggedo's idea to tunnel himself out a secret chamber directly under Ozma's palace, and there establish a kingdom of his own. But when they had almost reached the spot, the earth began to crumble away, and a few strokes of Ruggedo's spade revealed a great dark cavern already tunneled by someone else. It was huge and the exact shape of the royal palace. This Ruggedo discovered by careful measurement, and also that it was directly beneath the gorgeous green edifice, so that the footsteps of the servants could be heard faintly, pattering to and fro. This dark underground retreat suited the former Gnome King exactly, and, without stopping to wonder to whom it had belonged, Ruggedo gleefully took possession. For almost 2 years he had lived here without anyone suspecting it, but so far his kingdom had not progressed very well. Wag had tried to coax some of his rabbit relations to serve the old gnome as subjects, but Ruggedo, besides his terrible temper, had a mean habit of pulling their ears, so that the whole crew had deserted the first week. He had pulled Wag's ears once, but the rabbit tore out a pawful of his whiskers and bit him so severely in the leg that Ruggedo had never dared to try it again. Wag had stayed partly because Ruggedo amused him and partly because of the bribes, for every day, in fear of losing his only retainer, Ruggedo brought Wag something from the Emerald City, something he had stolen. In return, Wag waited on the bad little gnome and listened to his grumblings against everybody in Oz. All the furnishings of this strange cave had been stolen from various houses in the Emerald City. The 27 brocade cushions had been taken, one at a time from the palace, the green emerald lamp also. Every day Ruggedo ran innocently about the city, pretending to visit this one and that, and every day cups, spoons, and candlesticks disappeared. The doll's rocker, which Ruggedo insisted upon calling his throne, had been taken from Betsy Bobbin, a little girl who lived with Ozma in the palace. He had lugged it through the secret passage with great difficulty. The wooden doll had been stolen from Trot, another of Ozma's companions. She was Trot's favorite doll, for she had been carved out of wood by Captain Bill, an old one-legged sailor who was one of the most celebrated characters in all Oz. He had carved her for Trot one day when they were on a picnic in the Winkie country, from the wood of a small yellow tree, and as Captain Bill had old-fashioned notions, Peg was a very old-fashioned doll. But she had splendid joints and could sit down and stand up. Her face was painted and as pleasant as laughing blue eyes, a turned-up nose, and a smiling mouth could make it. Trot had dressed her in a funny old-fashioned dress, with pantalettes, and then, thinking Peg too short a name, the little girl had added Amy, because she was so amiable, she confided laughingly to the old sailor. Captain Bill had wagged his head understandingly, and Peg Amy had straightway become the most popular doll in the palace, that is, until she disappeared, for Ruggedo had found her one day in the garden and, chuckling wickedly, had carried her off to his cave. How Trot would have felt if she had seen her poor doll being shaken and scolded by the old Gnome King! But Trot never knew. She hunted and hunted for her doll and finally gave up in despair. Fortunately, Peg was well made, or she would have been shaken to bits, but her joints held bravely, and nothing, not even the terrible scolding of the bad old gnome, could change her pleasant expression. Being the sole subject of so wicked a king, however, was wearing even for a wooden doll, and Peg was beginning to show signs of wear. Her nose was badly chipped, one pantalette was missing, and both sleeves had been jerked from her dress by the furious old gnome. If the rabbit was around, Ruggedo did not shake Peg as hard as he wanted to, but when the rabbit was gone, he pretended she was his old steward, Kaliko, and scolded and flung her about to his heart's content. When not carving his history or shaking Peg, Ruggedo had spent most of his time digging new tunnels and chambers, so that leading off from the main cavern was a perfect network of underground passages. In the back of Ruggedo's head was a notion that someday he would conquer the Emerald City, regain his magic powers, and then, after changing all the inhabitants to moldy muffins, return to his dominions and oust Kaliko from his throne. Just how this was to be done he had not decided, but the secret passages would be useful, so meanwhile he dug secret passages. Above ground the little rascal went about so meekly and pretended to be so delighted with his life among the inhabitants of the Emerald City that Ozma really thought he had reformed. Wag, to whom he confided his plans, would shake his head gloomily and often planned to leave the services of the wicked old gnome. There was no real harm in Wag, but the rabbit had a weakness for collecting, and the spoons, cups, and odds and ends that Ruggedo brought him from the Emerald City filled him with delight. He felt that they were not gotten honestly, but his work for Ruggedo was honest and hard, and it's not my fault if the old Scrabble-Scratch steals 'em, Wag would mumble to himself. In his heart he knew that he was doing wrong to stay with Ruggedo, but like all foolish creatures he could not make up his mind to go. So this very night, while the old gnome sat playing the accordion and howling doleful snatches of the gnome national air, Wag was gloating over his treasures. They quite filled his little dugout room. There were 2 emerald plates, a gold pencil, a dozen china cups and saucers, 20 thimbles stolen from the work-baskets of the good dames of Oz, scraps of silk, pictures, and almost everything you could imagine. "I'll soon have enough to marry and go to housekeeping on," murmured the rabbit, clasping his paws and twitching his nose very fast. He picked up a pair of purple wool socks that had once belonged to a little girl's doll and regarded them rapturously. Out of all the articles Ruggedo had given him, Wag considered these purple socks the most valuable, perhaps because they exactly fitted him and were the only things he could really use. The squeaking of the accordion stopped at last, and, supposing his wicked little master had retired for the night, Wag prepared to enjoy himself. Draping a green silk scarf over his shoulders, he strutted before the mirror, pretending he was a courtier of Oz. Then, throwing down the scarf, he sat down on the floor and had just drawn on one of the socks when a loud, shrill scream from Ruggedo made his ears stand straight on end in amazement. "What now?" coughed the rabbit, seizing the candle. Ruggedo was on his knees before the rocking chair. "As I was sitting here playing and singing," spluttered the old gnome, "I noticed a little ring in one of the rocks on the floor." "Well, what of it?" sniffed Wag, leaning down to pull up his sock. "What of it?" shrieked the gnome. "What of it, you poor, puny earthworm?" "Look!" Leaning over Rugido's shoulder and dropping hot candle grease down the gnome's neck, Wag peered into a square opening in the floor. There lay a small gold box. Studded in gems on the lid were these words, "Glegg's Box of Mixed Magic." "Mixed magic!" stuttered Wag, dropping the candle. "Oh, my socks and soup spoons!" Ruggedo said nothing, but his little red eyes blazed maliciously. Reaching down, he lifted out the box and, clasping it to his fat little stomach, shook his fist at the high domed ceiling of the cave. "Now," hissed Ruggedo triumphantly, "now we shall see what mixed magic will do to the Emerald City of Oz." Chapter 7. Sir Hokus and the Giants. "Oh," sighed Sir Hokus of Pokes and Oz, stretching his armored legs to the fire, "how I yearn to slay a giant! How it would refresh me!" "Hast any real giants in Oz, Dorothy? Don't you remember the candy giant?" laughed the little girl, looking up from the handkerchief she was making for Ozma. "Not to my taste," said the knight, though his vest buttons were vastly nourishing. "Well, there's Mr. Yoop. He's a real blood-and-bone giant." "There are plenty of giants, I guess, if we knew just where to find them," said the little girl, biting off her thread. "Find 'em, bind 'em, get behind 'em, hocus pocus, he don't mind 'em," screamed the patchwork girl, bounding out of her chair. "But why can't you stay peaceably at home, Old Ironsides, and be jolly like the rest of us?" "You don't understand, Scraps," put in Dorothy gravely. "Sir Hokus is a knight, and it is a true knight's duty to slay giants and dragons and go on quests." "That it is, my Lady Patches," boomed Sir Hokus, puffing out his chest. "I've rested here in idleness long enough. Tomorrow, with Ozma's permission, I shall start on a giant quest. I'd go with you, only I've promised to help Ozma count the royal emeralds," said the Scarecrow, who had ridden over from his Cornier residence to spend a week with his old friends in the Emerald City. "Giants, sir, are bluff and rude, and might mistake a man for food." "Hocus pocus, be discreet, or you will soon be giant meat," chuckled the Patchwork Girl, crooking her finger under the knight's nose. "Nonsense," blustered Sir Hokus, waving Scraps aside. Rising from his green armchair, he strode up and down the room, his armor clanking at every step. Straightway the company began to tell about wild giants they had read of or known. Trot and Betsy Bobbin held hands as they sat together on the sofa, and Toto, Dorothy's small dog, crept closer to his little mistress, the bristles on his back rising higher as each story was finished. "Giant stories are all very well, but why tell 'em at night?" shivered Toto, peering nervously at the long shadows in the corners of the room. It was the evening after Ruggedo's strange discovery of the mixed magic, and in the royal palace, Ozma and most of the courtiers had retired. But a few of Princess Dorothy's special friends had gathered in the cozy sitting room of her apartment to talk about old times. They were very unusual and interesting friends, not at all the sort one would expect to find in a royal palace, even in fairyland. Dorothy herself, before she had become a Princess of Oz, had been a little girl from Kansas, but, after several visits to this delightful country, she had preferred to make Oz her home. Trot and Betsy Bobbin also had come from the United States by way of shipwrecks, so to speak, and had been invited to remain by Ozma, the little fairy princess who ruled Oz, and now each of these girls had a cozy little apartment in the royal palace. Toto had come with Dorothy, but the rest of the company were of more or less magic extraction. The Scarecrow, a stuffed straw person with a marvelous set of mixed brains given to him by the Wizard of Oz, was Dorothy's favorite. In fact, she had discovered him herself upon a Munchkin farm, lifted him down from his beanpole, and brought him to the Emerald City. Tik-Tok was a wonderful man made entirely of copper, who could talk, think, and act as well as the next fellow when properly wound. You would have been amazed to hear the giant story he was ticking off at this very minute. As for Scraps, she had been made by a magician's wife out of old pieces of patchwork and magically brought to life. Her bright patches, yarn hair, and silver suspender button eyes gave Scraps so comical an expression that just to look at her tickled one's funny bone. Her head was full of nonsense rhymes, and she was so amusing and cheerful that Ozma insisted upon her living with the rest of the celebrities in the Emerald City. Sir Hokus of Pokes was a comparative newcomer in the capital city of Oz. Yet the night was so old that it would give me lumbago just to try to count up his birthdays. He dated back to King Arthur, in fact, and had been wished into the land of Oz centuries before by an enemy sorcerer. Dorothy had found and rescued him, with the Cowardly Lion's help, from Pokes, the dullest kingdom in Oz. As there were no other knights in the Emerald City, Sir Hokus was much stared at and admired.